Starting to notice a pattern here with a bunch of these different articles. Maybe it's not so much notice a pattern as it is kind of reinforce a thought process that I've kind of cultivated for a while, but most of the best cures, okay, don't come from a bottle, don't come from a pill or an injection or anything like that. They just come from, natural sources, okay? Obviously, there are some things that require medical intervention, but natural way is more often the place to start. And if it can fix it from there, hey, you're better off. Healing properties of fresh air. We're talking about fresh air. Okay, last thoughts. Are appreciated since ancient times. When Pliny the Elder, just get to the topic. History of open air hearing. Okay, I don't need to have an entire history lesson. Okay, according to Calignon. All right, the effects of the outdoor air were widely exploited during the late 19th and early 20th century. First, in the treatment of tuberculosis patients who underwent open-air therapy, the science Andrea. The secondly, by military surgeons during the First World War, he wrote. We used the same open-air regimen to specifically designated hospital wards to disinfect and heal severe wounds among others injured soldiers. I have no idea what accent that was. It just felt appropriate. Okay, merch. English physician John, don't need to misgender somebody who's been dead for the better part of 200 years, 200 plus years, actually 207 years if we're going to get specific. John Cockley lets them breathe some fresh air. Was among the first advocates for what later became known as the open air method. He exposed children who had tuberculosis to sea air and sunshine at the Royal Sea Bathing House in Kent, England in 1791, according to an article published in the American Journal of Public Health in 2009. The germicidal effects of fresh air were further harnessed during the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic. Oh, and people were actually dying during a pandemic of the thing that they were causing and calling the pandemic for. Weird. Never experienced that before in my life. When a common to place the sick outdoors in tents or open-air hospitals. Records from the open-air hospital in Boston during the Spanish flu outbreak suggested that patients and staff there were spared the worst of the outbreaks. Interesting. Maybe it's just a tough Irish kid thing. Fresh air and sunlight are two things notably lacking in modern hospitals. Yeah, they're just all sterilized with their incandescent lighting and flashes from smart cams because they're doing TikTok dances. But were in abundance in Camp Brooks Hospital, which treated hundreds of patients during the 1919 influenza pandemic. Treatment took place outdoors to maximize sunshine and fresh air. The Surgeon General at the Massachusetts State Guard, William A. Brooks, reported the typical general hospital with 76 influenza cases. 20 patients died in a 3-day period, while 17 nurses became ill. By contrast, researchers wrote, according to one estimate, the regiment adopted at the camp reduced the fatality of hospital cases from 40% to about 13%. Wow. Later in the 50s, an open-air regimen was produced as a mass treatment for burns in the event of nuclear war. Oh, what a time to be alive. Hey, kids, duck and cover. Duck. Anyways, under such disaster conditions, adequate number of dressings in the facilities for their use were unlikely to be available. The open-air regimen was considered the only viable treatment. Control of infection was considered to be an outstanding feature of this approach. Yeah, interesting. I don't know exactly how open air and humidity are going to help with radiation poisoning, but hey, to each their own, I guess. Glad you didn't have to, put that theory into practice. So what about the open air, a germicidal factor? There are multiple factors to reduce infection risk in outdoor spaces. Infectious particles more rapidly diluted and dispersed for starters, while temperature and humidity variations could inactivate viruses. Ultraviolet light from the sun is also known to inactivate viruses such as influenza and coronaviruses. Not the current one that's going around, but the classification of diseases known as coronaviruses. Not to mention that sunlight would be boosted in patients' vitamin D levels, a deficiency which may increase susceptibility to influenza and other respiratory infections. Interesting. However, the direct germicidal properties of outdoor air are blatantly overlooked, despite a 1968 study published in the journal Nature that revealed a germicidal property in rural air. Oh, where it's not polluted by large cities? Imagine that. Another check mark in the box for living in the country right there. The experiment showed that outdoor air was more lethal to airborne pathogens than indoor air, and the scientists developed a technique to measure the effects of outdoor air on the survival of bacteria, viruses, and spores. Collignon, some French name, explained. Tests were initially carried out during the hours of darkness as, in common with other bacteria and viruses, E. coli are rapidly killed by sunlight. The E. coli samples exposed to the outside air usually died off rapidly, but not so indoors. On other occasions, E. coli samples in free air lost viability in 30 minutes, whereas those in enclosed air survived for several hours. Wow. Germicidal component in the air was dubbed OAF, but the researchers were unable to identify what exactly is the compound of that time. In the 70s, the researchers determined that OAF wasn't a single compound, but rather a mixture of highly reactive chemical species which varied in composition. In 2021, experts in atmospheric science again revisited OAF, agreeing that no singular molecule or class of molecules appear to be responsible for the high levels of bactericidal activity reported. They even concluded that hydroxyl radicals, HOs, components of OAF known to kill airborne pathogens aren't responsible for the observed germicidal activity. They concluded, we identify other potential candidates which are formed in the ozone alkaline reactions and have known and likely germicidal properties, but the compounds responsible for OAF remain a mystery. Ongoing mystery of how OAF works may be a key reason why it's continued to be neglected in public health and infection control. Very true. You don't know how something works. How can you act on it? Oh, good question. Could increased ventilation preserve OAF indoors? Researchers into OAF in the 60s found the germicidal effects of outdoor air could be preserved in indoor simulations if ventilation rates were high enough. Specifically, 30 to 60 air changes per hour were necessary to preserve OAF. Interesting. Researcher into older pre-50s hospital wards used by tuberculosis patients which had multiple large wings and tall ceilings suggests that they had ventilation rates of 40 air changes per hour and lower tuberculosis infection rates compared to the modern hospitals. Reality is modern day hospitals are super spreaders of disease. Dun dun dun. Who could have possibly seen that happening? Meanwhile, the importance of proper ventilation continues to be largely ignored, even as a study for Center for Disease Control and Prevention found the improved ventilation, such as opening a window, reduced the coof cases in Georgia schools more than mask mandates for staff and teachers. Yeah, I don't want to talk about that, of course, because you need to sell and hawk fear. Of course, time to rediscover the power of fresh air. Oh, hell yeah. It was 1914 when Dr. Robert Sandby, we're going back in time now? All right then, professor of medicine at Birmingham University, said, why we have been so slow to recognize that fresh air is the best tonic or the best antiseptic. I imagine he sounded like a southern gentleman. This is Birmingham University after all. Birmingham? Whatever, it's down south. Collignon believes that it's time to again devote our attention to the importance of fresh air in hospitals, schools, offices, and other buildings, and harness its healing effects in the prevention and treatment of infection diseases. He is calling for testing to determine the effects of OAF on established and novel pathogens. Exactly. Research to determine how long OAF can be preserved indoors and how to best preserve it. A review of the building designs with a focus on increased exposure to outdoor air and OAF in order to improve infection control and patient recovery. On a personnel level, it is important to take advantage of the restorative powers of fresh air as much as possible. Personnel or personal? Personal. Should be with an E, right? No, personnel is with an E. My mistake. Possible by opening windows and spending time outdoors, particularly in natural areas. Take a look earlier in the week. Talked about walking with poles. You should do that. It'll make you less sick, I guess. Further, Collignon suggested that rediscovering open-air wards and open-air regimen may be beneficial for hospital patients. Yeah, where it's allowed, because if you were to try that up here in Grand Prairie, Alberta, back at the time when the COOF was first kicking off, you would have found it a bit trifling and a little bit of a troublesome situation, considering middle of March, northern Alberta. You go ahead and connect the dots there. Just stick people outside, okay? Yeah, no, they aren't sick anymore, but they're also awfully cold and unresponsive. Weird. But yeah, harnessing OAF, figuring what the heck it is, and can also be useful to reduce disease transmission in the community, including schools, homes, offices, and other large buildings. Yeah, and places of transportation, places that have high human turnover, and then also enclosed spaces in general. Harness the power of that. You might be onto something, Chief. And it looks like you got a long enough time frame so that you don't have to put any sort of hasty research behind the stuff in order to propagandize the public in order to take something experimental that could cost them their life down the road. But anyways, less said about that, the less controversial. And I've done enough through the week on that. So with all that said, thank you all very much for the gift of your time. I've been Don Consuelo. I want you to follow your gut and get after it. Take care, everyone.